Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started, and we may see other people into the room. Welcome to our event today. Welcome to, virtually so, to the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. This is the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Munk School. And what we have here today is part of the Eurasia Initiative at CERES. Professor Sarah Cameron from the University of Maryland is here today, here beamed in from from College Park, right? Or somewhere near.
From Tacoma Park, Maryland.
Tacoma Park, okay, from Tacoma Park, Maryland. Professor Cameron was scheduled to come in March of this year, and of course we know how that ended up. So we're delighted to do the second best, which is invite her back to talk about her path-breaking and award-winning research on the Kazakh Famine, which has won a whole ton of awards. So let me get all the awards straight here. Sarah probably has them committed to memory, but I don't. Sarah's book has won 4 book awards so far. The Reggie Zelnick Book Prize, the W. Bruce Lincoln Book Prize, the Joseph Rothschild Prize in Nationalism and Ethnic Studies, and the Southern Conference on Slavic Studies Book Prize. Those are the ones she won. She also got 2 honorable mentions, the Wayne S. Vucinich Book Prize and the Helt Prize. This is, I have to say, for somebody who works in the broad field of Eurasian studies, this is unheard of for someone to do a nearly total sweep of these kinds of awards. But it actually doesn't surprise me. I've had the privilege of knowing Sarah since she was a PhD student at Yale, and it was very clear to me that this is a person who is incredibly thoughtful, incredibly intellectually driven and honest at the same time, and had a nose for a topic that was that really required a lot of hard work and was going to be make an important contribution. Sarah, welcome virtually to the University of Toronto. It's great to have you here. And what I'll do is I'll turn off my video and allow you to share your screen and your PowerPoint as you see fit. And of course, Sarah, if you have any questions, just let me know and I'll come back. I'm online. What we'll do is we'll go for about 35 minutes or so. We'll turn it over to Q&A. Audience members, there is a Q&A button, question and answer button at the bottom of your screen with any luck. You're welcome to post questions there. We won't turn to those questions until the Q&A begins. So again, 30 or 35 minutes after, or whenever Sarah's done, essentially. And then we'll begin to take your questions, and I'll moderate that portion of the discussion. Anyway, welcome to Toronto, sort of, Karen.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ed, for that really kind introduction. It's really wonderful to be here virtually. I'd also like to say that Ed was also really helpful and quite instrumental actually in my getting started in the field. There are very few people who work on Kazakhstan, and I remember he was, especially when I was getting started, he was always incredibly patient with answering all of my questions. And so I think, I know I'm very, very grateful to him for that as well. So let me share my screen here and I'll get started. So I'd like to speak today about my book, which is titled, the same title of my talk, The Hungry Steppe, Famine, Violence, and the Making of Soviet Kazakhstan. And I'll speak for about 30 minutes about the book. The book examines the largely neglected, the book you can see here, it examines the largely neglected story of the Kazakh famine of 1930 to 31. This leads to the death of 1.5 million people. And in my talk today, I'll talk about how I approached telling this story, how I approached working on such a sensitive topic, one that continues to reverberate in Kazakhstan today. And along the way, I'll talk a little bit about how the book itself has been received in Kazakhstan. Russian and Kazakh translations of the book came out earlier this year. In the early 1990s, Zhe Abashuli spoke about his memories of the Kazakh famine. I was still a child, but I could not forget this, Abashuli recalled. My bones are shaking as these memories come into my mind. During the famine, activists with the Soviet regime had stripped Abashuli's family of their livestock and grain. His father's relatives had fled Soviet Kazakhstan entirely, escaping across the border to China. For those who remained, Abashuli concluded hunger was, quote, a silent enemy. He remembered the arba, or horse-drawn cart, that collected the bodies of the dead, dumping them into mass burial grounds on the outskirts of settlements. During World War II, Abashuli would go on to fight on the front lines for the Red Army. Nonetheless, he concluded, quote, surviving a famine is no less than surviving a war, end quote. As Abashuli's recollections reveal, the period 1930 to 33 was a time of almost unimaginable suffering in the Soviet Republic of Kazakhstan, a vast territory in the heart of Central Asia, wedged between China and Russia. You can see it here. As hunger set in during the famine, over 1 million starving refugees from Kazakhstan flood neighboring Soviet territories as well as China. They create a regional crisis of unprecedented proportions. Some never returned to Kazakhstan, and today's significant diaspora populations, many of them are descendants of those who fled during the famine's course. They remain in the countries that surround Kazakhstan. Prior to the famine, most Kazakhs practiced pastoral nomadism. And by that, I mean, you can see a shot of a nomad from the period that they carry out seasonal migrations along predefined routes to pasture their animals. The famine forces Kazakhs to sedentarize or abandon the economic practice of nomadism, and this shift leads to very painful and far-reaching changes to Kazakh culture and identity. In its staggering human toll, the Kazakh famine is certainly one of the most heinous crimes of the Stalinist regime. Some 1.5 million people, a third of all Kazakhs, perish in this. By the percentage of lives lost, the Kazakh famine is the Soviet Union's worst collectivization disaster. But the story of this famine has remained largely hidden from view, both in Kazakhstan and in the West. Major narratives of the Stalin era mention the Kazakh disaster only in passing, and until recently, even some of the famine's major events and factors weren't well known. My book recovers this largely unknown story. It begins in the last decades of the Russian Empire, the 1890s. It follows the Republic through the tumultuous years of the imposition of Soviet rule and Stalin's attempt to consolidate his hold over the steppe through a violent modernization program that focused on collectivizing the Kazakhs. And it concludes with the Republic's slow road to economic recovery in the post-famine years of the mid-1930s. I argue that the Kazakh famine of 1930 to 33 was the result of Moscow's radical attempt to transform the nomadic peoples of the steppe, who were known as Kazakhs, and a particular territory, Soviet Kazakhstan, into a modern Soviet nation. I find that through the most violent means, the Kazakh famine creates Soviet Kazakhstan, a stable territory with clearly delineated boundaries that was an integral part of the Soviet system. I also find that it creates a new Kazakh national identity that largely supplants Kazakhs' previous identification with the system of pastoral nomadism. In the famine's aftermath, Kazakhs begin to think of themselves as a national group as opposed to a social group, one oriented around the system of pastoral nomadism. And the creation of the specifically Soviet Kazakh nationality was in fact a goal of Stalin's efforts to transform the steppe. Through equipping non-Russian groups such as the Kazakhs, Ukrainians, and others with their own territories, languages, and cultures, Moscow sought to make them into modern Soviet nationalities and integrate them into the collectivist whole. But in many other respects, Moscow fails to achieve its goals. Neither Kazakhstan nor Kazakhs themselves become integrated into the Soviet system in precisely the ways that Moscow had hoped. And for those Kazakhs who lived through these hungry years, the experience of this famine was deeply traumatic. D. Albekov, who got, in his words, quote, a taste of starvation, living through the famine as a young child, noted, quote, today I tell people I don't remember the famine. Ultimately, the scars from this famine would haunt the Republic throughout the remainder of the Soviet era and shape its transformation into independent nation in 1991. Indeed, in Kazakhstan today, where the famine remains a largely forbidden topic, due in part to Kazakhstan's close relationship with Russia, the publication of my book has inspired intense debate about the meaning of the Soviet past and the nature of modern Kazakh identity. Nearly every major news organization in Kazakhstan covered my book's release. Without my permission, an op-ed that I wrote to promote the book was translated into Russian and Kazakh, and made into a Facebook video that has generated over 115,000 hits. Dozens of Kazakhs wrote to tell me stories of the horrors that their families had endured during the famine. The chairman of the Senate, who is now president of Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, you can see here, he commented on my book on Twitter. And more recently, although prior to the outbreak of the coronavirus, the book even featured in a demonstration by the Kazakh diaspora in Times Square. So how did I approach telling this story and working on such a sensitive topic? I think there are three overarching goals that influenced how I wrote the book, and that's what I'll discuss in the remainder of the time. They are first goal, centering the horrors that Kazakhs endured. Secondly, introducing new methodologies such as environmental history into our study of the Soviet collectivization famines. And third, telling a multifaceted story of the Kazakh disaster, one that integrates the perspectives of Moscow, the Republic's bureaucracy, and Kazakhs themselves. Turning to my first goal, my primary goal in this book was to center the horrors that the Kazakhs endured, to reveal the Kazakh famine for what it is, one of the great crimes of the Stalinist regime. Soon after I published this book, I did an interview with a Kazakh journalist. The journalist told me that her grandparents had died during the famine. Like many others, they sought relief during the famine, and they tried to flee across the Kazakhstan's border to China, which you can see here. But before they could reach China, they were brutally murdered by Soviet border guards. Their fate was actually not that uncommon. As my research has revealed, in fact, thousands of starving Kazakhs were killed by Soviet border guards on the Sino-Kazakh border during the height of the famine. This is actually in stark contrast to some less coercive methods of border control that were practiced in the Soviet Union's West during the same time period, such as deportations. And the brutality with which starving Kazakhs were treated is a fact that's little known to most historians of the Soviet period, and most frustrating to this journalist. It's something that is not yet fully acknowledged or recognized by Kazakhstan's post-Soviet leaders today. In recent years, this journalist has tried to understand where her grandparents' bodies might be. She's pieced together local lore. She's worked with the relatives of others who fled from the same region. Together, they've identified a mass grave site near the Sino-Kazakh border that is the probable resting place of their relatives. They have estimated that approximately 1,000 people perished in this massacre alone. And they've erected a simple memorial on the spot, which you can see in this image here. After telling me about her family's own history, the journalist then asked me about an inscription at the beginning of my book. I had included at the beginning of my book a Kazakh proverb. That proverb roughly translates as, quote, "Until the spirits of the dead are honored, the living will not prosper," end quote. She asked me if the proverb was my, quote, "my ethical philosophical motivation for writing the book," and how I might respond to those Kazakhs who would say that a foreigner could not possibly contribute to a project of such national importance. I paused. I never really quite thought about these questions in this way, nor been confronted with someone who had such a deeply personal connection to the issue. I said writing about such an important subject is not something that I took lightly. I had immersed myself in Kazakh culture, and I'd spent years researching and writing this book. I told her that I hoped my status as an outsider might serve as an advantage in some cases, enabling me to see patterns or themes that those who are raised in Kazakh culture might not necessarily see. And as to her first question about whether the proverb was my, quote, ethical philosophical motivation for writing the book, after some reflection, I said yes. So many of the stories of those who suffered during the famine have been silenced, lost, or forgotten. We know that a horrifying number of people died during the Kazakh famine, but it can be very difficult to comprehend what that meant in human terms. I told the journalist that if my book had in some small way honored those who had died, then its most important goal had been achieved. How did I actually seek to do this in the book? First, through close engagement with the literature from another discipline, anthropology, I sought to portray pastoral nomadism, which is often seen as a backwards way of life, as a highly sophisticated system. So the Kazakh steppe has a sharp continental climate. It has hot summers, very cold winters. It's also arid and prone to drought. And you get a sense of this from looking at this map here. So in the yellow areas, those are the areas where where Kazakhstan is classified as semi-desert or desert. There are more fertile areas in the north. And in my book, I show that Kazakh's practice of pastoral nomadism was an adaptation to these distinctive environmental features, particularly the scarcity of good pasture land and water. Previous scholarship on the Kazakh famine has tended to downplay the disaster's violent nature and imply that it originated from natural causes. It's been called, quote, a miscalculation by Stalin, a tragedy, or even a misunderstanding of cultures. Such depictions, I argue, have been in part influenced by evolutionary theory, which holds that the disappearance of nomadic peoples and their transformation into settled societies, that this is part of the inevitable outgrowth of modernity. My book, by contrast, shows that there's actually nothing inevitable about this famine. In fact, Moscow receives very clear warnings about the dangers of settling the Kazakh nomads. Moscow's sweeping efforts to transform the steppe clearly anticipate the cultural destruction of Kazakh society. And I find ultimately that the Kazakh disaster may fit an expanded definition of genocide. Another way that I sought to center the stories of Kazakhs was through my source base. Most nomadic societies are oral rather than literary societies, and they tend to leave fewer traces in the written record. It's more challenging to uncover their stories. And the sources that we do have about nomadic peoples are often filled with assumptions. To counter such tendencies, I tried as much as I could to tell the story through the voices of Kazakhs themselves. I utilized sources in Russian, but I also utilized sources in Kazakh, which is of course a Turkic language entirely distinct from Russian. I use archival sources in the book, but I also use sources that were not produced by the Communist Party or the state, such as memoirs or published oral history accounts. And it's through this approach, through centering the horrors that the Kazakhs endured, we also get a more complete view of what this destruction actually meant for Kazakhs themselves. Pastoral nomadism, I show in the book, it's not just an economic strategy. It's not just a way of making use of the steppe's scarce resources. It's also a crucial source of identity. Here you can see another shot of Kazakh nomadic life during the 1920s. This one comes actually from the American Museum of Natural History. Historically, it was the practice of pastoral nomadism that had determined who was Kazakh and who was not in the steppe region. But this assault on this way of life, I show, transformed a distinct culture. It would have important effects on the way modern Kazakh identity would be constructed by Soviet planners and later, after the Soviet collapse, reimagined by post-Soviet nationalists. Today, in many respects, we might conceive of Kazakhstan as a post-traumatic society. Ibrahim Husamudinov, for instance, who lived through the famine as a young boy, saw starving Kazakhs dying in the streets on his way to school. More than 50 years later, he noted, quote, "To this day, I can hear the desperate cries of the dying and their calls for help." More than 50 years later, many Kazakhs are still coming to terms with the horrors of what they endured. A second goal of my book was to integrate different methodologies into our study of the Soviet collectivization famines. To date, the study of the subject has been dominated by a state-centered approach. The major trigger for the famine in Kazakhstan was collectivization, which was part of Joseph Stalin's radical scheme to help the Soviet Union industrialize, boost agricultural production, and catch up with the capitalist West. And at the same time that the famine hits Kazakhstan, it also afflicts other parts of the Soviet Union, most notably Ukraine and parts of Russia. Across the Soviet Union, somewhere between 5 and 9 million people perish. In the literature, a long-running and polemical debate has focused on the question of whether the famine that hits Ukraine was used by Stalin to punish Ukrainians as an ethnic group. The story of collectivization in the Soviet Union has come to focus largely on Ukrainians, to the exclusion of the Kazakh disaster. the issue of the famine has become and still remains a significant source of tension between Ukraine and Russia. Indeed, the highly politicized nature of these famines has played a major role in how they've been studied. Most scholars adopt a state-centered approach. They focus tightly on Moscow's decision-making during the launch of forced collectivization with an eye to understanding how the regime's actions might have contributed to or mitigated hunger. But such an approach, one that focuses closely on the years of the famine itself, is actually at odds with the broader literature on famines. That literature has shown how both abrupt change and slower moving structural processes can combine to produce a famine. Focusing solely on the state also ignores the very real environmental challenges that the regime faced in transforming an arid landscape like the Kazakh Steppe into an agrarian region. If we return to this environmental map here, you get a sense from this that the environment of the Kazakh Steppe, like other arid regions, was very unstable. Rainfall patterns could vary dramatically from year to year. You know, you could have an excellent harvest one year and a disastrous one the next. The distribution of good quality soils could shift. You could have what were once good quality soils becoming very heavily salinated over time. To correct some of these tendencies in the literature, I use a wider lens than just the years of the famine itself. I situate the Kazakh crisis in the longer history of the Russian Empire's efforts to transform the Kazakh Steppe into an agrarian region. I show that changes begun under Russian imperial rule, particularly the settlement of the Kazakh Steppe by more than 1 million settlers from European Russia, provoked important shifts to Kazakh diet and migration routes. These changes make Kazakhs more vulnerable to famine. It's doubtful that famine would have broken out anywhere in the 1930s without the Soviet regime's assault on the countryside. But as I show, the legacies of Russian imperial rule must be considered a contributing factor. I also introduce methods from environmental history. I show that environmental change, namely a drought in the summer of 1931, became a factor in the famine. This deepens Kazakhs' descent into hunger once Moscow's assault on Kazakh life had already begun. And here you can see some shots of some people fleeing the famine. You get a sense from these photos, and I know, of course, also from working with the documents, that these are probably some of the earlier refugees. As the famine wears on, the sources are quite unanimous in how destitute Kazakhs are. They don't even have any warm clothing. They've sold it. They've tried to boil it up or even eat it, and so on. But the weather, I reveal in my book, is not a kind of independent factor, something that the regime could not control. Rather, I show actually that the regime had clear information about the risks of nomadic settlement and the possibility of a drought. So turning to my third goal, the integration of different levels of analysis. One of the challenges in telling a story like this, I think, in telling the story of the Kazakh famine, is that in trying to center the Kazakh story, you might fall sway to a narrative of victimization. This narrative is particularly prevalent in the literature on the Ukrainian famine, where some have framed Ukrainians as the unwitting victims of Stalin's assault on the countryside. And returning to the Times Square photo, you can see that some of it has surfaced in the Kazakh case as well. You can see that these Kazakh activists here are actually clearly drawing upon what some Ukrainian activists have tried to do, which is connecting a famine that occurred during the Civil War with the famine of the 1930s. So they're trying to situate the Kazakh famine of the 1930s in a kind of longer narrative of Kazakh suffering against Russian and Soviet oppression. These narratives of victimization have surfaced for many reasons, and they have at times been given, actually, I would argue, further credence by the analytic lenses that scholars have used to study Stalinist crimes. They analyze these crimes from the top down or from the bottom up. And for all that's been written about the Stalinist regime's use of violence against particular ethnic groups, we actually have very few studies that look at how these campaigns have been implemented locally. And in the absence of such studies, the default assumption has been that such violence was committed by Russians or outsiders sent from Moscow. So a third goal that I had in the writing of my book was to tell a multifaceted story, to integrate the perspectives of Moscow, the Republic's party-state bureaucracy, and ordinary Kazakhs. Ultimately, my book follows several stories over the course of the crisis, tracing the intersections and tensions between them. First, the evolution of Moscow's policies towards the nomadic peoples of the steppe. Second, the creation of a local level Soviet bureaucracy in Kazakhstan and the reasons why many Kazakhs came to participate in an assault on their own society. Third, and finally, it explores the ways that ordinary Kazakhs experienced the terrifying years of the famine and what such experiences meant for the nature of Kazakh identity. Here's an image of one of the Kazakhs I follow in my book, Smagul Sadbakasov. He's pictured in the center there, who serves as Kazakhstan's Commissar of Enlightenment. I show that in the Kazakh case, as in famines more generally, the notion of victimhood is very complicated. Survival during the famine demanded ingenuity, good fortune, and on occasion, ruthless and cruel behavior. Hunger, I show, actually could override very strong taboos and inhibitions, even compelling some to commit cannibalism. During the Kazakh famine, incidents of crime rose and communal bonds started to break down. As the Kazakh memoirist Muhammad Shayakhmetov recalled, quote, everyone was now preoccupied by getting something to eat for the following day, or that same day, or that very moment to relieve their hunger pangs. Even the kindest-hearted people and closest friends and relatives could no longer help one another out, end quote. I also show that Moscow's transformation of the Kazakh steppe achieved its peculiarly devastating power, not because it was carried out by Russians or outsiders sent from Moscow. Rather, it was because Moscow partially succeeded in destroying Kazakh society from within. In a strategy purposely designed to shatter old allegiances and sow violent conflict in Kazakh communities, Moscow actually empowers Kazakhs themselves to make some of the most crucial choices in the collectivization campaign, such as who should be considered an exploiter and how much grain to confiscate from them. And as my book reveals, the efforts of these local cadres were crucial. They shaped the scale of the violence, its intensity, but also the character of the violence, including which groups won out and which groups lost. Ultimately, I believe such a lens also helps us shed new light on the nature of the Soviet state, Soviet nation-making, or the project of molding certain groups into cohesive nationalities was not just imposed from above. Rather, it was participatory, and my book stresses the ways that Kazakhs themselves shaped Soviet Kazakhstan's eventual integration into state structures. So I'll leave it there for now, and I look forward to your questions.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah, for a terrific presentation. The book, of course, goes into a lot more detail, and it's the nuance that Sarah is able to achieve in terms of some of the big questions that she just could sketch out in broad outline here is really evident if you tackle the individual chapters. Buy it; it's award-winning. It makes a terrific holiday gift, and maybe not an uplifting holiday gift, but nonetheless a terrific one. And it's terrific. It's scholarship, just absolutely top flight stuff. So the Q&A tab is at the bottom of the screens. Please submit any questions that you might have. I have some questions just as we're waiting for the audience members to contribute their own thoughts. Rest assured that if you type in something in the Q&A tab, it will come to us, though I don't know what it looks like on your end, but we will have received it. So have confidence in that. So I have I have a whole bunch of questions because this is, right up my alley. And of course you've done, as with any sort of path-breaking research, it poses additional questions that you partially get to, but I wonder about how you're thinking into it. Talk about this expanded definition of genocide that you think that the Kazakh famine might qualify as, because one of the things, if you look at sort of the UN definition of genocide, taking that as a starting point, I realize there are many other ways you can slice this particular pie, but it really emphasizes, or part of the definition is intentionality, right? The intention of perpetrators to exterminate. And I wonder what we know about, and of course not having the intention to, maybe not absolve, maybe doesn't necessarily absolve the perpetrators of guilt here, but I wonder what we know about the degree of awareness of the likely consequences of the mass and forcible sedentarization campaign. In other words, how much did people know in Moscow, and how confident are we in the evidence or in our ability to sort of get into their heads? I mean, what do we know on that score? So I'll just leave that. I see there's a bunch of other things coming. So while you're answering, I will take a peek at the questions coming in.
Okay, thanks for this question. Obviously, a big important question for the book. Maybe just so everyone's on the same page, I argue in the book that, well, of course, the question of whether the Kazakh famine is a genocide, it depends upon the definition used. Given the evidence that I have at hand, I feel like it doesn't fit the UN definition, which requires intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. That we do not see, at any point that these plans for a violent modernization of Kazakh society, they become transformed into a desire to eliminate Kazakhs as an ethnic group. And so that's why given the evidence that I have now, I don't feel that it will fit the UN definition. I speculate in the book that it might fit a broader definitions of genocide, what Ed is referring to, particularly the definition coined by Raphael Lemkin before it was hammered into another meeting by the UN definition. And that definition focuses more on non-physical methods of destruction, like social and cultural destruction. And I think that, we see very clear evidence that they knew exactly what they were doing when that they anticipated that their assault on Kazakh society would result in the destruction of Kazakhs as a social group. And so I think the intentionality in that respect, in intending to destroy Kazakhs as a social group, is actually very, very clear. There's very clear evidence of that, that that's what they anticipated. I mean, I think in general, I think they did not, they did not know much about Kazakh society. They were pretty poorly informed about it. We don't have many mentions of Stalin, for instance, specifically talking about the Kazakhs. Although they did get very clear information as, as the assault was going on, of the consequences of their actions. And I think also various stereotypes about nomadic life fed these further assaults, particularly the idea that nomads just always had immense numbers of animals, that this kind of contributed to this cycle of violence. More generally, I guess the question of genocide is obviously a very, very sensitive question. It's also a question that has immense personal meaning to many people in Kazakhstan. And so the broader point that I also try to make in the book, that the fact that this crime doesn't seem to fit the US definition, that doesn't make it any less worthy of our attention. It doesn't make the crime less horrible. In fact, what it really points out to us is some of the problems with the UN definition. And if we focus only on that definition, we miss some of these really, really terrible things that have happened, like the Kazakh famine. And so it should really challenge us to rethink the way we kind of categorize mass atrocities.
Okay, great. So there are a bunch of questions that have come in. I'm going to group a couple together just to keep things rolling. So first, I see a note from John Stanley. He asks, what impact did the Stalinist purges have on the Communist Party leadership? Did any of these leaders raise questions about Moscow's policies or note its impact on the ground? So that's the first question. I'm going to bundle in a second one, which is probably unrelated, but see what you can do. Our own Professor Lynn Viola says, hi, Sarah, welcome to Toronto, sort of. She thanks you for your book. She's intrigued by your brief note of a post-traumatic society. Could you develop the notion for us? And could you talk about the ways in which the post-Soviet Kazakh government has viewed or used the famine over the past 30 years, right? How it's dealt with its with this particularly painful moment in its past.
Okay, so the impact of the purges on the Stalinist party leadership and the impact on the ground. I mean, in Kazakhstan, even as the famine is ongoing, or as it gets rolling in the 1920s, there are attacks on many leading Kazakhs, particularly those Kazakhs with ties to Alash Orda, which is a Kazakh group that briefly sided against the Bolsheviks during the Civil War. So as the famine is ongoing, there's also a kind of broader effort to remove leading Kazakhs with sort of suspicious ties. And so this also must be viewed as part of Moscow's assault on Kazakh society, that it wasn't just the attempt to transform Kazakh society on the ground, nomadic society, but it was also an attempt to transform Kazakh cadres, right? To create a group of cadres who were loyal to them. And even in these attacks on Alash Orda, we see also other Kazakhs actively participating in this and giving the regime information and so on. With regards to Kazakhstan as a post-traumatic society, I guess it's not yet a concept that I've probably had the opportunity to develop that well. It's something that actually began to occur to me in some part after the reaction to my book, because I was absolutely overwhelmed, and still am, by the outpouring that it has caused in Kazakhstan. It's part of a broader, I think there's been a broader upsurge of interest in the famine in Kazakhstan right now. So maybe just to back up, and to answer fully your question, Professor Viola's question, is to say that the famine itself has taken, the reaction to the famine has taken a completely different, or a very different trajectory than the response in Ukraine to the Ukrainian famine, where in Ukraine, the Ukrainian famine has become central to the creation of a national memory. In Kazakhstan, the famine briefly bursts into view in the years around the 1990s. There's a lot of investigation of it then. There's actually a presidential commission which declares that the famine represents the quote-unquote politics of genocide. Nazarbayev, the leader of Kazakhstan, is involved in it. Some of the literature that develops in that time period has a fairly nasty anti-Semitic element to it. Goloshokin, who was the leader of Kazakhstan at the time, is portrayed as the architect of the famine, and Goloshokin himself is Jewish. But then by the late 1990s, this interest disappears. When I was doing my research, people told me that they're no longer encouraged to work on the topic, that they're encouraged to work on other things. There are actually literally monuments to the famine that were half built and left there. But then right around 2012, there was an upsurge of interest and also some greater recognition on the part of Nazarbayev, and then more lately his successor, Tokayev. You started to see at that point actually the state-sponsored efforts to erect memorials and some greater discussion of it. However, I would say that this interest is also still very much within a very limited frame. There is been no greater attempt to discuss the question of personal responsibility, personal culpability. In some senses, the Kazakh line on the famine also dovetails a bit with the Russian government line on the famine. You even see them still saying this is kind of a tragedy of the Soviet peoples. You see them saying we want to avoid politicizing this famine, clearly evoking Ukrainian efforts. But what sort of really became clear to me from the reactions to my book, just ordinary people writing me, people telling me about massacres that I had never even heard of, that there is still in Kazakhstan this enormous need for a working through and a coming to terms of what the famine meant for Kazakh society. So I think that's why I would use that term. But again, I would say, and I say this in my book, that I really felt that the focus of my book had to be on the story of the famine itself, and the memory of the famine, and in a way its aftermath is another incredibly important topic that really deserves its own full-fledged study. So I'm not sure I can claim to convincingly answer that question yet.
Okay, great. I mean, there's so many. I mean, as a historian of the early Soviet period, you have to be true to yourself as a historian. The secondary question is the natural one, which is how is this history used, right? And that's something that, you know, we should chat, right? Because this is an interdisciplinary kind of opportunity, right? There's a lot of opportunity for discussion. In fact, as you were talking, I was thinking about some of the efforts by, I think, mostly historians, and if I'm not mistaken, at George Washington, the sort of Soviet Memoirs project. I wonder, I'll just pose a quick question on that, sort of a two-thing, and then I'll get to two others from the list. Is there any appetite for making oral testimonies about the famine a part of this sort of broader project, or maybe it would be a separate project, but somehow getting down in some recorded fashion the testimonies of people who were affected either directly or probably indirectly by these kinds of things. So I wonder about that. Let me ask two more questions from the list, just so I don't monopolize things. We've got a question from Enes Alalouf. It sort of follows on in a way on Lynn Viola's question. He asks about the famine with respect to, or I suppose in comparison to other kinds of Soviet legacies that you know continue to have an impact on post-Soviet Kazakhstan. So the Baikonur Cosmodrome, right? It's not as if it's gone away. The nuclear testing at Semipalatinsk, right? And you can see other kinds of things. I wonder if you notice any kind of, I'm now paraphrasing Enes's question, I wonder if you see variation in how the past is treated, or if it's all kind of, maybe you haven't looked at it, that's the other possibility, but does it seem to be treated within the same kind of narrow frame as, you know, affected by, well, the fact that you've got a very large, powerful neighbor to the north. And then let me ask, the third thing I'll say is just turn to is Alison Smith, Professor Alison Smith's question. Can you talk a little bit more about numbers? She notices that the Twitter and protest images shown have people using numbers that are higher than the ones that you gave. And so Alison would like to hear a bit more about whether there are any particular issues that you lie behind the use of these different kinds of numbers.
Yep, okay, great, all wonderful questions. Thank you so much. I guess I'll answer your first question about the question of oral testimonies. So this is a very important question, and it's something that also, when we think about the source base, say for the Kazakh famine versus the Ukrainian famine, there are very real and striking differences. One of which is for the Ukrainian famine, we have so many more memoirs, oral histories, these sorts of things available. And this is what makes telling the Kazakh story so challenging. You know, you were dealing with a culture that was largely an oral, literary culture, and also because of the particular politics of the Kazakh famine, there was not the same effort as there was in Ukraine to collect detailed oral histories. Many of them, there are a few. There's a couple that there was one or two done early in the 1990s, and there were some that were begun, unfortunately, very, very late. You know, like 2010. You know, by the point that many of these people who were still around, they were very little children during the famine, and now they're very elderly. So there just has not been the same effort to collect oral history. I have subsequently tried to urge, you know, whenever I speak about the topic and whenever I speak about it to Kazakhs, to urge them to do another type of oral history project, which would be really focused on collecting memories. You know, what did you hear from your grandparents? What did you hear from your parents about this topic? Because that's been also one of the most incredible things about the book, is people just writing and telling these stories, amazing family stories. And I think this is another way to capture the human side of the famine. And I think with some caution, these stories can also be read and be used as a really wonderful type of source into the question of what effect the famine had on Kazakhstan, both during the famine and in the post-famine years. So the famine in comparison to other Soviet legacies, it's an interesting question. I'm really not sure I can answer it quite yet, because to a certain extent we don't have really good accounts on some of those topics. I would say some of the things you mentioned, so Baikonur, that just does not occupy the same point or point of reference in Kazakhs' consciousness to the famine. I would say that they have been, Kazakhs, the subject of, say, nuclear testing, which you also mentioned, is not something that is nearly as sensitive as the famine. It is not so directly associated with Russian influence. There have been much more, there was an attempt to compensate victims of the nuclear testing. It is just not nearly such a sensitive issue as the famine. World War II is another topic that has also is very foremost in Kazakhs' consciousness, but again, it doesn't carry the same sensitivity as the famine. The famine is really, I think, and also just to give another example, the terror, the Great Terror in Kazakhstan, something that has been explored actually much more openly and tackled much more head-on than the famine. So Kazakhstan has a national day of remembrance, but it is officially, and if you look at some other countries, Ukraine, that day would explicitly include victims of the famine. So in Kazakhstan, that day of national remembrance, it is a day for the victims of political repression. So actually in its very title, it excludes the victims of the famine. And in recent years, some people have been very angry about this, and they've actually pushed for explicit reference of victims of the famine, but you have not seen them do this. So I would say to some extent, the famine is actually quite distinct as sort of an event in Kazakh consciousness. It carries this extraordinary sensitivity that other crimes of the Soviet regime, and actually just one other comes to mind, of course, is Karlag, this enormous forced labor camp that was built in Kazakhstan. Again, there's a museum to Karlag. There's a very open, in some senses open, exploration of this topic. There is no museum to the famine. There is just absolutely nothing on the same scale, even though, of course, the scope of the famine and what it did to Kazakh society was far more sweeping than what happened with Karlag. And I think a lot of that, the reasons for this, it's a difficult question. A lot of it, of course, has to do with Kazakhstan's close relationship with Russia, the very tendentious way that discussions of the famine have gone in Ukraine. It also, I've had Kazakhs say to me, look, we were nomads before, and now we're a modern society. So some of it also has to do with this belief that Soviet modernization also brought enormous benefits. So to the question of numbers, really important question, and I discuss it a bit in my book. So one of the great challenges in working on the Kazakh famine is that we do not have a comprehensive breakdown of the death toll. So it is clear that the numbers are absolutely immense. It is very clear that by percentage, the Kazakhs had the highest numbers lost. It's just absolutely shocking. But one of the things that is also tremendously striking is that there's just been no real attempt to work through it comprehensively. If you look, for instance, at what Harvard has done on the Ukrainian famine, there's been this whole recent effort to look at the death toll, to look at how it broke down regionally, and to also use that information about how it broke down regionally to then in turn revisit some of the major theories for the famine, and I think that's actually led to the work that they've done at Harvard on the demographics of the Ukrainian famine has then led them to revisit and to revise some of their understandings of that. And it's been, I think, extraordinarily useful. In the Kazakh case, that work simply has not been done. People often ask me, how did this famine break down regionally? I can give you my best guesses about how it broke down regionally, based upon the sources, based upon what I've I've seen, but I don't have the numbers, and that's a real gap. That said, I've in my own work, the numbers I've used numbers developed by Stephen Wheatcroft and Robert Davies in their book. And I've also used one of the more recent estimates by Hurry, includes a slice of the Kazakh disaster. It includes the years 1932 to 1934. That's actually only a very partial snapshot of the Kazakh famine, because one of the features of the Kazakh famine is that it begins earlier than the Ukrainian famine. And so if we look at those years, you're actually missing a huge part of the death toll, I would argue. Even for those years, they give a snapshot of 1.3 million. So in my work, I used 1.5 million overall deaths. I think I say it several times in the book, it could be at least 1.5 million. It well could be more. Actually, a Kazakh presidential commission during the 1990s reached a conclusion of 2.2 million. So, and some Kazakh demographers have also actually gone higher with some of their estimates. As you might imagine, it's pretty challenging to do the work on the death toll for the Kazakh famine for many reasons. One is many more Kazakhs than in the Ukrainian case fled. They fled to neighboring republics. They also flee to Xinjiang. So if you're doing work, some of them don't return. So if you're doing work on the death toll, you also have to do work on, how many of those people stayed there, how many of them came back. For Xinjiang in this period, you don't necessarily have good population data. Nonetheless, it's my understanding from talking to demographers that this kind of work, that we could get a better understanding of the death toll. That work just simply hasn't actually been done yet.
Great. No, that's really helpful. And we sort of see in real time right now during a different kind of a crisis how, how difficult it is to collect numbers that are sort of beyond reproach, right? Even we're living through that in real time with the COVID-19 numbers and all the difficulties there. And this is of course shrouded in greater difficulties with the sort of evidentiary base and so on. Challenging but important kind of area for sure. I did want to ask very briefly if the earlier efforts on the part of the regime to try to affect the mode of economy of the pastoral nomadic Kazakhs resulted in sort of mini famines or mini kinds of tragedies. Because I know there were land reform efforts, so-called, by the regime in the 1920s, and they kind of pulled back from them. And I wonder if they pulled back. Maybe you don't know, maybe you didn't look at it, but I've always wondered: did they pull back because it wasn't working? Did they pull back because it was starting to generate tragic outcomes? We know that Stalin comes not to care about the tragic outcomes or sees them as necessary for building this new state. But I wonder if you look comparatively at some of the other efforts before, and if not, that's fine as well. Let me turn to one question, and we have slightly fewer coming in now, so I think we can slow down. I'm just going to add one more. So Dr. Naveen Mehta asks, did climate and/or world depression have any impact on the Kazakh suffering in the 1930s? I mean, you mentioned variation in sort of climatic conditions, right? So year to year, there could be a drought or sort of a famine, or climatic conditions can vary, of course. I sense from this question is sort of a broader global. Is there anything happening around the globe at the moment that might have had some kind of impact in the case of Kazakhstan?
Okay, so earlier efforts of the regime and other types of famines. Well, of course, there's a famine during the Civil War. The region wasn't yet obviously under full control. I guess one of the differences, and we do not yet have a good study of the famine during the Civil War in this part of the former Russian Empire. That's still, it's still a big struggle. But these famines don't afflict all of the steppe. There's one famine during the Civil War that afflicts the area kind of around Tashkent, encompassing part of the Kazakh lands, and then also one that afflicts the north of the steppe. I mean, yes, so with regards to land reforms in the 1920s, yes, you definitely do see them pulling back at some points because they're you know, they're trying to do some of this land reform, but they actually find that it's counterproductive. So the land reform in part is motivated by their nationalities policy, this attempt to mold Kazakhs into a modern, you know, national group, to give lands to Kazakhs, but they actually find that it sort of backfires at certain points. But there's nothing that I have found in the literature to suggest anything, you know, close to what happens during collectivization. But we do see these sorts of experiments back and forth. With regards to the question about climate and world depression, so as far as I sort of dipped my toe a little bit into it. I hope to go further into the issue of climate on my next project on the Aral Sea. But I looked at, for instance, the rainfall numbers for this time period, and I did find that there was, if you look at just the rain and temperature data for this period, that there was actually a drought, as I mentioned, in the summer of 1931, and that does affect the outcome of the famine. I say that, you know, this is not something that we can get the regime off the hook for. They anticipated and knew in many senses that this was going to happen. I guess in the question of world depression, I mean, that we might say that the price of wheat perhaps affected the course of the famine, that the price of wheat actually falls, grain falls during this period, and this means that the Soviets actually have to sell more of it on world markets in order to get the cash that they need to industrialize. This was part of the motivation for collectivization. It was both a kind of cultural and an economic assault. And one of the economic reasons was that they needed grain to sell on markets to get hard currency to industrialize.
Super. There's a question from a student who wants to remain anonymous, so I will honor that. This person asks if you could briefly talk about your own experience writing and researching the book, about how you immersed yourself in Kazakh culture. Did you spend time in Kazakhstan? And do you feel immersion in the culture outside of academic work was integral to your research, especially given the deeply personal traumatic effects on people and your position as an outsider to society? That's her question. And let me fold in maybe something that might be somewhat related, but Lynn Viola asks a secondary question, which was actually mine as well, which is, what was your access, or what generally is the access to archives right now? We think about access to information, access to people's testimonies, access to bases of evidence. One of them sometimes is formalized in the question of archives. And I wonder what kind of reception you were given in the archives. I know that there are some, the former party archives, it's probably a little bit harder to get into than some of the state things, at least in Kazakhstan, but I wonder what your experience was with that.
So thank you very much. Maybe I'll take the archives question first. Kazakhstan is actually a wonderful place to do research in the archives. And, when I first thought about, I just got interested in Central Asia when I was working on my PhD. I came to study Soviet history, and I actually thought really pragmatically in the beginning. I wanted to work on Central Asia, and I looked and I felt like actually most of the work had been done on Uzbekistan. They used Uzbekistan as a way to characterize the region as a whole, and I thought, that doesn't make sense. They're very different societies. And then I looked pragmatically, okay, where can I get into the archives, and where hasn't there been a lot of research done? And that led me to Kazakhstan, and eventually to the subject of the famine. And in Kazakhstan, both the party and the state archives are open, which is really not true of some of the other surrounding countries. The party archives, in particular, it's now known as the Presidential Archives, is a wonderful archive, a highly professional archive. They're constantly producing new document collections. They have just come out with the second volume. So even as I was finishing up this book, they came out with the first volume of a series called The Tragedy of the Kazakh Aul, and it is unbelievable. It's really amazing work. The first volume is 800 pages. It has documents from all over, from Moscow, from from Kazakhstan, 800 pages of the first part of the famine. The second volume has just come out, another 800 pages devoted to the famine. And then the third volume is still pending. I was also very fortunate when I was there that they had actually just released a cache of documents pertaining to various inspectorate commissions that oversaw the famine. So I was very lucky in that I actually got to use those files, and these files had not yet really been fully worked through even by local historians. So I was actually very fortunate in the timing of what I did. And those enabled me to get insights into things that I didn't even find in Moscow, you know, like some of the violence on the Sino-Kazakh border. That's where I really found out about that. At the same time, we can say in Kazakhstan, so the secret police archives are not open, and also other things like Goloshokin's personal file. I've not been able to get access to that. I found that actually, on the whole, there are a few exceptions. There was a regional archive I tried to get access. I did work in one regional archive in Semipalatinsk. There was another one I tried to get access to. I think they just had a change of director. They were visibly very uncomfortable with me as an American coming. They told me that in order to get access, I needed special permission from the FSB. Well, that's equivalent to saying that you don't have access, right? You're not going to get access. But in general, I found people were actually very excited and eager that as an American scholar, I was working on this topic, that actually was a huge advantage to me, that they immediately understood that this was a topic that was very important to explain to a Western audience. And I think the fact that I had a topic that sort of ordinary people could understand, even, you know, not necessarily maybe beyond, say, scholars who are immersed in that work, that was really, really amazingly helpful. And a lot of local historians were actually tremendously helpful to me, local historians who worked on the famine. You know, I met with them, I talked with them, they gave me suggestions. So it really was, in Kazakhstan more generally, and sure Ed can speak to this point more broadly, but there's one of the most exciting things about it was that there's this tremendous, I found, eagerness and interest actually in collaborating with colleagues in the West, but people maybe don't necessarily know how to go about doing it. Very few scholars in Kazakhstan or historians that I met with speak English, so there are some barriers also to doing that sort of work. But it was actually one of the really neat things about working on this project is that I could really speak to local, you know, Kazakhstani historians about my work. So the second question, well, the first question really was about my own experience of writing and researching this book. Was that the question, Ed?
Yeah, I think the question more specifically was about immersing yourself more broadly. Like as an academic, how important is it to get out of your academic lane and immerse yourself more broadly in society? Did that play a role, or I guess how did that inform what you did?
Yeah, I felt like that is really, really important, and especially in a topic like this, whereas, you know, one of the most important things I think was to convey the magnitude, the scale of what happened. And also to, you know, I found one of the automatic knee-jerk reactions when I was first working on this topic, especially speaking to Soviet historians, is, you know, nomads. Oh, that's just really something that's very foreign to people in the Soviet field. And it takes a lot of work actually to explain what that is, why it was so fundamental to Kazakh life, and why it was actually so consequential that this way of life was destroyed. So in terms of my own experience, I spent an awful lot of time in Kazakhstan. You know, my longest stretch there was maybe about 13 to 14 months. But all told, you know, maybe I spent 18, 20 months altogether. I made several trips back and forth. I made a real effort to learn Kazakh, which I think was also very important to the book. I didn't, you know, most of the sources in the book are in Russian, but I think the Kazakh sources were tremendously important in a lot of ways. There are some primary sources that I used that were really important, but also the secondary literature. because one of the things I discovered was that in Kazakhstan, there's a distinct secondary literature in Kazakh. It asks different questions, people speak to different problems, they're speaking to different audiences. One of the leading scholars of the famine in Kazakhstan, Talas Omarbekov, he rarely publishes in Russian. He really only publishes in Kazakh, and I asked him about this and said, yeah, you know, I could publish in Russian if I wanted to, but this is a Kazakh problem. You know, this is the audience that I'm speaking to. And so, yes, I felt that my experience of being in Kazakhstan and spending a lot of time there, of immersing myself in Kazakh culture, in making many wonderful Kazakh friends, this really enabled me to tell the story, I hope, in the way that I did.
Great, that's really helpful. That just a bit on the archives. It's great to hear that the archives are so open. I remember doing a little bit of work in the archives in the late 1990s, and there was no access that I could manage to the presidential stuff, the former pardon stuff. That's obviously changed.
Yeah,
terrific.
I'll also comment on that. I mean, I should say that when I was there were also still some unusual restrictions in the presidential archives. I couldn't photocopy anything. I actually had to bring in a notebook, and I had to write all my notes by hand. And then before I was allowed to bring that notebook home, they checked it. Now, I was always terrified that they were going to take my notebook away. And so I took to bringing very small notebooks in the hopes that, you know, I didn't want to lose like a month's worth of research or something. But subsequently, I had talked to, you know, other scholars who worked there, and they have told me, well, thankfully that whole notebook system has been done away with. That actually they're much more open about doing photocopies. You know, these sorts of things weren't allowed when I was there. That actually it's become even more so than it was before, a really great place to do research. Great.
And since you've opened up so many interesting questions, you know, undergrads or graduate students or others who are thinking about new research projects, I'm guessing we'll find both a lot to think about and the opportunity apparently to gain access to the documents that one would need to do this kind of important work. There's a question from Murat Rustiamov who says, thank you very much for an interesting presentation. Could you please explain how has this famine in the Kazakh steppe influenced the formation of Kazakh identity? What can you say about about changes that might have occurred to Kazakh identity as a result of the famine?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's so actually this was one of the central themes of my book. I argue that actually the famine resulted, so if prior to the famine, most Kazakhs were oriented around the system of pastoral nomadism, that nomadism was one of the defining features of their way of life, that actually in the aftermath of the famine, nationality becomes implanted as one of the major features of Kazakh identity. But I also argue that various other features of Kazakh identity don't disappear. Nomadism by no means disappeared. I think we can say that nomadism is destroyed as an economic system. But various features of nomadism, say for instance, Kazakhs' reliance on clans. This is something that Ed has also explored, that these become transformed by the famine. They're divorced from their origins in pastoral nomadism, but they also continue to influence Kazakh life. Islam also continues to influence Kazakh life. So it's, and we see even also nomadism being used in Kazakhstan today as a kind of usable past, actually. I always, in some talks I've given, I show this slide. Today in Kazakhstan, one of the most important symbols is a golden man who is supposed to be one of the ancestors, according to some, you might ask, of the Kazakhs. And his remains were found he's a Scythian warrior. His remains were found in the Kazakh steppe. And I think Kazakhstan today, actually its leaders very much use nomadism as a usable past, a way to craft a modern Kazakh identity. So the famine had enormously consequential impacts on Kazakh identity. At the same point, I would also say that a number of things that followed, particularly World War II, which Roberto Carmack has explored in his more recent book, that these also had important impacts on the shaping of modern Kazakh identity.
Okay, no, that's terrific. I think I've caught up with the questions. So if anyone has any last ones, please feel free to chime in. And unless there's a deluge, we should be able to accommodate them in the last couple of minutes here. Let me ask one. I mean, one of the remarkable things about your work, again, is just how relevant it is to people in the region. You found that out through the reception.
Yeah.
But I think it's also terrific and maybe too rare that scholars would be so involved in, I would say, in some kind of way, giving back to the societies that they're studying, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes there's a perception, it may be right, it may be wrong, that Western scholars will, go to a region, extract material, and then come back and make, a career for themselves. This is the extremely cynical version of the argument. That's clearly not what's happening here. I mean, you've been very engaged with people on the ground. You care deeply. That's evident from all your interactions and just how you talk about it. You care very deeply about Kazakhstan and its history. It's also quite unusual, I think, to see sort of simultaneous translations really right on the heels of the English language version that's being, distributed apparently pretty widely in Kazakhstan. I guess I wonder if you could talk about, I guess anything. I wonder about a little bit about the reception. Is there a different reception that you're getting from those who are reading in Russian and those who are reading in Kazakh? Is there a different distribution of the book? Do you know anything about your audience? I'm sort of wondering about the sort of resonance this is happening in different sort of communities on the ground. Anything that you can say or discern from that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, to me, I have to say this has been the single most rewarding aspect of the book. I never, now it made me actually realize, the reception to the book made me realize that I actually didn't quite understand what was going on in Kazakhstan. And I think maybe, I mean, we could talk about this, I'm sure, at some length afterwards, but that there's actually some pretty interesting changes going on in Kazakhstan right now. And I was really struck by, I expected, well, I know that famine is a controversial subject in Kazakhstan, maybe it might get an article or two in the press. And I really didn't expect that all of a sudden that the book was going to be all over the newspapers, every single news outlet contacting me. And so I think it's also really influenced how I think about my next project. As I said, I want to work on the Aral Sea, and that's also a project, I think it doesn't have quite the same position in, say, Kazakh, it doesn't, nor nearly the same position in Kazakh memory, but it's also still that something is of tremendous contemporary relevance because the Aral Sea crisis is still ongoing. And I'm really interested in tackling those sorts of projects that have appeal, that are important, really important historical problems, but also have this immediate contemporary relevance as well. But with regards to your question about the different reception, so I would say most of the reception I saw initially was actually to the English translation, or sorry, to the English version of the book. A lot of it was a reaction to the Wall Street Journal op-ed that I wrote, which just was like, it sort of spread like wildfire across Kazakhstan. It was translated to Russian and Kazakh. Almost every single newspaper republished it. I think some of it might have been the fact that this is the first time they had seen an American, say these things about the Kazakh famine. I think a lot of it, the reaction to the book, has to do with the very fact that I am an American. For many Kazakhs, the fact that specifically an American is speaking about this issue, I think, regardless of what I say, that it just has tremendous symbolic meaning to them. That, finally, in their eyes, this is an issue that is being recognized on the world stage. I think that, and so it's also made me reflect a bit on my position as an American scholar and some of what, that carries. In most of the reaction has been actually to the English version, and the interesting thing is many Kazakhs were reacting to it not knowing exactly what I'd said. And so most of the reaction was praise. I would say that thank you, for writing this. There's also some criticism, and some of that came from people with links to Russian state media. They said, she's trying to drive, of course, they hadn't read the book either, but they had an opinion on it, that I was trying to put a wedge between Kazakhstan and Russia, that I was using famine as an instrument of geopolitics and these sorts of things. So there was definitely some of that emerging. So with regards to the Kazakh and Russian translations, yes, there's been an awful lot of work focused on that. And I didn't really quite anticipate what was involved in translating a book. It was a huge amount of work. I had wonderful translators. It's nothing to do with them. It's just I didn't quite anticipate. But I was very lucky in the presses that I went with. So for the Russian translation, I worked with NLO, which is a Novaya Literaturное Обозрение, a very well-established Russian press who's got really excellent translators. And then for the Kazakh one, it proved very difficult to find a translator and a press, actually, because the publishing industry in Kazakhstan is not very well developed. But at the same time, I sensed there was a very strong demand for it. So Dosum Satpayev, who's a sort of a public intellectual in Kazakhstan, he agreed to take on the project and supervise it. Publishing is not his main field, but he's a very adept at, he put a lot of effort into making sure there was a high quality translation, and he was also been very adept at publicizing the book. So unfortunately, both Russian and Kazakh translations came out during the height of the pandemic. And of course, as you know, the pandemic has meant that very understandably, people's attention is focused elsewhere. But even so, the Kazakh one came out right around this day, which is sometimes used to remember the victims of the famine. And it became a bestseller. I've found very interesting reactions to it. I found some younger people telling me, this is just really amazing. I've not understood this part of my country's history before. Other people saying, I tried to give this book to my grandmother, but she didn't want to read it. She's someone who, and so this is, I'm still learning about this, and it's been really fascinating to me. The Russian one came out the Russian version came out much more recently. So only, a couple months ago. So I haven't yet heard about some of the reactions to it, nor of course have I had the chance to visit Kazakhstan since all of this has happened for obvious reasons, but I'll be very curious to hear more about it.
Yeah, I mean, the back to the question of trauma or post-trauma, or maybe not quite post-trauma, the fact that people are not, at least the older generation, might be too traumatized to read it.
Yeah.
I assume that's how we're interpreting that moment, right?
Yeah.
That strikes me as familiar. I mean, from other kinds of world historical traumas, generations scarred by it may be happy that it's being recorded and being recognized on the world stage, and yet they don't need to read it themselves. I remember my father from a Holocaust generation, not affected directly, but still couldn't read anything about the Holocaust. It was just too sensitive, too difficult. There's one last question in the Q&A, and it's about the Kazakh repatriates, right? The Orolman, who presumably because of the famine. I mean, I guess Orolman probably refers to anybody who left Kazakhstan in general at any point, but presumably the major exodus was during the famine itself. And these are people who, of course, as you know, who were repatriated to Kazakhstan. There were programs, I assume they're ongoing now, to repatriate those in China, Mongolia, perhaps elsewhere. And the question is really about how, this is from Ennis as well, our former master's student here. The question is about how they fit into this sort of narrative, right? Presumably they were affected in particular kinds of ways, but they're also, by virtue of not being Sovietized, right? Sometimes held up as, the owners, the possessors of a sort of authentic Kazakh culture, which might include elements of pastoral nomadism or other kinds of things that were not exterminated. So they kind of preserve, right? That's the notion, the pre-Soviet authentic practices, and then they come back, and yet they have this weird reception in Kazakh society. So I don't know, anything that you can say about that? I'm not sure if it fits directly into your historical work, but any thoughts?
Yeah, so the Orolman Orolmandar, Orolmansi, Russian term, these are actually, so the Nazarbayev under Nazarbayev, there was a program, it's actually now, as I understand, been canceled or brought to an end, to bring back, to repatriate ethnic Kazakhs from abroad. These are people, it was part of a program actually to lift the number, to boost the number of ethnic Kazakhs in Kazakhstan. Many of these people were brought back. They were moved back with promises of land and of citizenship. Unfortunately, in some respects, it caused a lot of tensions. These people weren't given the land that they were promised. Many of them didn't speak, do not speak Russian, which is, you know, the language in many of Kazakhstan cities. It's the language of business. And so it made it very difficult for some of these families in terms of their return. Many of them also learned Kazakh in a different alphabet. So say, for instance, Kazakhs who fled to Xinjiang, they would have continued learning Kazakh in the Arabic script, whereas in Kazakhstan today, still today they use the Cyrillic script. There's a plan to transition it to the Latinate script, but still it's the Cyrillic script that's mostly in use. So not all of the Orolman, not all of these people who fled were during the famine. There were also, of course, other cross-border flows even prior to that. And in places like Xinjiang and Mongolia, there's long been an ethnic Kazakh community, right? The borders of Kazakhstan do not, even when they were drawn, of course, don't coincide neatly to the places where many Kazakhs lived. Yeah, I mean, I think these people also, many of them, when they came back, some of them were, as far as and here I'm relying on the work of many, you know, excellent anthropologists who've looked into this topic. There's been a couple studies by anthropologists of the Orolman project. It's one of the largest, as I understand it, repatriation programs in the world. Many of these Orolman were stigmatized. They were at the, you know, in the one point seen as the emblems of sort of Kazakhhness, of what it meant to be Kazakh, but on the other hand, they were stigmatized because, you know, they didn't speak Russian, some of these other problems, and some of them were also associated with the famine itself. So one of the narratives during the Soviet period about people who fled to places like Xinjiang were not that they were refugees, but actually that they were exploiters, that they were people, rich people, who were, say, fleeing across the border. And you see that old Soviet narrative actually resurfacing in some ways with the treatment of, and again, here I'm relying on the work of anthropologist colleagues who looked at this, but some of the Orolmansi are accused of, you know, of also the same thing. Oh, you fled Kazakhstan during this time of great need. You abandoned us. So we see some of those same things resurfacing.
Such a rich topic. I mean, testimony to that is, as Sarah and I talked about at the beginning, many of these Zoom events don't go the full allotted time, but we basically have, because there's so much to talk about, and it's such terrific and, like I said, world-class, award-winning research. It's really great to have had you visit us in this place that we're provisionally calling the Munk School, at least a Zoom chat provided by a Zoom opportunity provided by the Munk School. Sarah, we really look forward to your next work on the RLC, and thanks to everyone in the audience for the great questions and for participating. Look forward to seeing you next time. We have an event on the 23rd with Hannah Chapman, who works on, this is also part of the Eurasia Initiative, not a historian. She works on post-Soviet Russian politics, and I think she'll be talking about disinformation or the management of information in Russian media space, the relationship between the state and media. But stay tuned for that, and hopefully you can join us as well. Thanks again, Sarah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
We'll see you.